Recently, we've witnessed an unbelievable scene unfold. As we all know, Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan dictator, has frauded the election. And where I live, people are surprised by it. I am not, because that's how every socialist country ends up, under a dictatorship. And in today's video, we are going to explore why it's natural for a socialist regime to turn into an authoritarian one. First, what is the guiding principle of socialism? Equality. Its goal is to build an equal society, a society where there are neither poor nor rich people, because wealth is equally distributed. Left-wing people often imagine a place where everyone makes enough to have a good life, like in an European country.
When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela, I'm not looking at Cuba, I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden.
But that's a joke when we see the reality of the socialist experiments we had in the past and still have to this day. And by the way, there's no democratic socialism, and you will soon understand why. Socialism and democracy are completely incompatible. Anyway, what people miss here is that equality, which again is one of the leading principles of socialism, implies suppression, repression. You see, there are two main principles, so to speak, equality and freedom. People usually say they want both, but that's just impossible, because if you give people freedom, as they are intrinsically different, they will follow different directions, which of course will result in different outcomes. So one person can end up really well, while another can just make the wrong decisions, ending up bad. Now, I'm not saying that if you make all the right choices, things will turn out well for you, and that luck doesn't exist. No, there are no guarantees. The point is, if you give people freedom, inequality will arise as a consequence. Now, let's think about equality. Imagine you have 3 sons and you want all of them to be alike. Let's say you are a lawyer and you want them all to follow your footsteps. Now, 2 of them are okay with this, but 1 is not. One of them wants to be a chef. Well, if you want your sons to follow the same path as you, if you want them to be equal in that sense, well, you will need to suppress the desire of the one who wants to study cooking, right? You will need to make him stay in line. You will have to suppress his freedom of choice. And that's an example of how trying to achieve equality leads to repression. So, as you can see, freedom and equality just don't mix well together. They are actually opposites. It's like water and oil. So it's not a surprise that a government operating under the premise of reducing inequality ends up reducing freedom. And how does this translate into the economy and society? Well, let's say a government comes to power with exactly this cause, reducing inequality and helping the poor, which is an extremely common political cause. After all, who will be the monster to be against it, right? So let's say a government with this kind of mindset takes over. To reduce poverty, giving poor people and the unemployed a pension, for example, this money has to be collected from someone else's pocket, by force. After all, the government only has money because it collects from others by coercion. If you don't pay your taxes, well, you are screwed, right? People don't give money to the government, to a bunch of bureaucrats, because they want it, but because they are obliged to. So even if the state is doing this, increasing taxes to help the poor, with good intentions, things are already starting off on the wrong foot. Authoritarianism is already present because someone is putting its hands in your pocket and taking what's yours against your will. So in the name of equality, you end up suppressing other people's freedom to use their own property, their own money as they wish. And again, that's how these two principles, equality and freedom, conflict with each other. And in my opinion, that's the first reason why socialist regimes converge into authoritarianism, because they operate under the wrong principle. Its foundations were built on the wrong ground. If a society is based under the principle of equality, you will need to use force to make people equal, redistributing their wealth. So you already begin with some form of authoritarianism. Now, it's interesting the fact that people often think an equal society is obviously better. They imagine a place where everyone has enough for a good life, as I said. But they forget that you can also have equality in absolute poverty. If two people have zero, they are perfectly equal. And that's what often ends up happening. So the important thing is not equality, but dealing with poverty. And guess what? There's nothing better than freedom to reduce poverty. People want to rise up, make money, and improve their lives. If they are free to do this, if they can keep the money they earn, you can bet they will do just that, generate wealth. Actually, this is the conclusion that Deng Xiaoping came to after decades of communism in China. As he famously said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. What he meant was that the important thing was to escape poverty, no matter what ideological position one might need to assume. If it was necessary, he was ready to liberalize his regime to make it happen. That's why China opened special economic zones, places that became open to the world with more freedom in every sense. And that's how the Chinese began their economic rise in the second half of the last century. Now, it's also logical to assume a socialist regime will turn into an authoritarian one because of the power centralization proposal. You see, in a socialist regime, the state assumes the role to distribute all the wealth in a fair and equal way. So instead of having several dozens of individual and independent entities, you have only this central entity that holds all the power and resources. Remember, in a socialist regime, the state takes control of all private means of production. And we will soon come back to this because that's very important and dangerous. But this is absolutely crucial to understand. In a socialist regime, things are ruled by the center, by the state, who holds all the power. Now, does this sound a good idea for you? Concentrating such power? Because if power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And such central organization of society can only be led by the use of force. After all, again, people will only give their resources to the state if they are forced to do so. Oh, but the state wants all these resources to do good for the population, to give us a free healthcare system, free public transportation, free internet. But there are some problems with that because let's say the people who set up this central organization are indeed good people with good intentions. First, in a certain way, they are already corrupt for being so convinced of the integrity of their own intentions. They are already corrupt for thinking they are so right that it justifies using force to fulfill their vision. And you know, the most harm of all is done when power is in the hands of people who are absolutely certain of the purity of their own intentions. You can argue Lenin had good intentions. Well, maybe not, but my point is that his goal was, in a certain way, to build a new and better world, with no oppression and exploitation. The problem is that he was so convinced he was ultimately right that he was willing to use any methods at all for the ultimate good, and he was willing to leave millions die to achieve his vision. That was the only problem. Additionally, even if we assume that the people who set out this type of social organization are indeed good, what's the chance of them being replaced by people with really bad intentions who are way more efficient at getting control by force? So that's the other reason why socialist regimes turn into dictatorships, because a central entity needs to operate by force, and it will probably be controlled by people who are good at using coercion. Now, another important point is this. In a socialist regime, the state takes control of all private means of production. Now, when people hear means of production, they usually picture things like factories and machinery, but it goes way beyond that. What exactly is a means of production? You can argue that almost anything is a means of production. This camera, for example, I'm using it to record this video and share an important message. So, is this camera a means of production? Absolutely, just like this computer and my cell phone, just like a car can be. But do you know what the biggest means of production is? Humans themselves. It's no surprise that in socialist regimes, people end up enslaved, working in forced labor camps, as happened in China and the USSR, Cambodia, North Korea, and Cuba. If all private means of production end up being owned by the state, it means that people themselves end up being owned by the state too. So after covering these points, I hope it's clear how socialism almost naturally evolves into a dictatorship. Socialism is guided by the wrong principle and concentrates too much power in just one entity, the state. Now, to close this video, something interesting happens to societies that have equality as their foundational principle. These types of societies end up with nothing. They become extremely unequal and lose all freedom, which is the opposite of what one would expect. Actually, I dare to say that socialist societies end up more unequal than capitalist ones that are based on the principle of freedom. Think about the inequality in Mao's China or in Stalin's Russia. Most of the population, hundreds of millions of people, starving while top bureaucrats lived in luxury. Stalin and Mao had incredible power. They made life and death decisions for an entire continent-sized country. The US president doesn't have this kind of absolute power. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, as rich as they are, don't even come close to that level of control. So, when a society chooses equality over freedom, it ends up with none of them. Well, I hope you can now better understand why socialism will never be democratic. That's it for today. See you next time.